Hey, Daniel, how's it going?
Hey, how are you, Scott? Great to be here.
Great to be here as well. And I'm so excited to be talking to you. My friend Dylan Bynan, who I believe you know as well, the founder of Mind Bloom, who also was a guest on this podcast, first introduced me to what you're doing at the EPRC. And when I saw it, I was like, thank God someone out there is trying to tackle this initiative because God knows the world needs it. So, in your words, what is the EPRC?
So the EPRC is the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, and we are now over 180-person international research consortium with people from a wide variety of professions and disciplines with a wide degree of backgrounds and phases of their career that is trying to upgrade the relationship between what we're calling emergent phenomena, which is spiritual, mystical, magical, energetic, psychedelic, etc. phenomena. So the deep end of interesting things that can happen in consciousness experience, to the world of clinical medicine, mental health, and public understandings in general. And so that obviously is a huge ask. And yet we're assembling a big team, and we're really going in fundraising to really do all of the science and things that you need to reach the clinical mainstream, which hasn't really been done in a degree that has gotten almost any penetration into the world of the DSM, ICD-10 and 11 billing codes, board certification criteria, National Health Service protocols, insurance reimbursement, and included in the textbooks of medical and mental health education. And so that's what we're trying to do. This is obviously a decades-long, extremely ambitious project, but we think this is a good time. We think the neuroscience is going to help us. We think the fact that meditation and psychedelics are scaling a lot is really going to help us. And that this is a good moment in history, despite all the complexities. There are a lot of opportunities right now and a lot of very important ethical reasons to do this. Because as anybody who's ever, had some of these experiences and crashed into the mainstream medical clinical world knows, that even though, my colleagues in emergency medicine, emergency psychiatry, and neurology and family practice and all of that went into this to know things and help people, they unfortunately know very little about this. And what they think they know isn't always so helpful. And so we need to help everybody involved in the system to do a whole lot better.
Amen. I mean, coming from a guy who had a 36-hour brain study where I was shaking violently with Kundalini energy and the doctors were telling me that everything was fine and I was just stressed out, I clearly agree with what you were saying.
I shouldn't be laughing at that. It's not funny, but it is funny. You know what I mean, right?
No, Jesus Christ, man. I'm like, is anybody watching the game tape here? Like, clearly I'm not okay. But let's get to the backstory a little bit. I mean, how did you get interested in emergent phenomena in the first place?
Yeah. So when I started having meditative experiences as a kid, and I took some basic meditation training in 10th grade in a weird hippie school, Carolina Friends School in Durham, North Carolina. And there was a class called Close Encounters where they introduced us some very basic visualization and, squeeze your toes and relax them and feel the, warm healing energy coming in and squeeze your legs. And so progressive relaxation techniques and some other techniques. And I thought those were just super cool and started having some interesting experiences. But it was around 14 or 15 years old. I've been a lucid flying dreamer since I was about 5, but I don't always have flying dreams or lucid dreams. But I really like it when I do, as anybody of you out there knows. If you've had these, they're pretty cool. And I wanted to have more of them. So I started visualizing flying before going to sleep. And that was enough meditation to get me into a situation where my consciousness exploded like a fireworks display. And I traveled out of my body for the first time. And I was never really the same after that. It structurally changed me and started some weird process. And about 10 years later, after having all kinds of odd, energetic, and bizarre experiences, like I was dancing at around 18 or 19 and became like a cone of energy, of blissful, rapturous energy going out through the roof of the club. This is totally sober. There's no substances involved in that. And then about 10 years later, I ran into some people who had a sense of these frameworks, and, they had a sense of what, energetic stuff was, and maps and territory and techniques and all kinds of ways to relate to this. And I started going on intensive meditation retreats, and that was, and was off and running at that point. So, but that's what I call Daniel 1. And then Daniel 2 is like pre-med and electrical engineering and public health school and all this biostatistics and very materialistically sort of, quantum mechanics-y, but very kind of materialist, and, doctor and emergency medicine and healthcare administration and all that stuff. And this is Daniel number 2. And I remember sitting there at the second year medical school where Daniel number 2 was being taught that Daniel number 1 either didn't exist and or was totally crazy and needed meds. And I was like, this is uncomfortable. And then, when these ended up being, even though they were initially quite weird and disconcerting and sometimes very challenging, they ended up being the most important and transformative experiences of my life and ended up leading to some really cool stuff. And then Daniel number 3 began to emerge when I retired, and Daniel number 3 was trying to figure out how these two could get along a whole lot better with, in my own world, and then work with a whole lot of people who had the same basic, thing. They were, MD PhDs at some top university, or neuroscientists or clinicians or psychiatrists or business people or whoever they were. And they had also had these experiences that they couldn't talk about, or they didn't understand well, or eventually they did, but, they knew the trouble that, or the benefits and all of that it could sometimes cause. And so all of us in the EPRC are trying to figure out how these two can get along a lot better and scale that globally in a really ethical, skillfully linguistic and cultural way, such that we can do what so far hasn't been done in terms of getting everybody on similar functional pages of being able to at least relate to these things in a much more skillful way than we currently do, with good outcome, based trials and all that stuff.
I mean, why, the last time we talked, you had mentioned that, you've talked to thousands and thousands of people who've had these type of experiences. Mm-hmm. We all can assume that that's probably just a fraction of the people that have actually had the courage to come up and talk about their experiences. So why are we in this position where there's an undeniable existence of this phenomenology, yet we have a system that does not acknowledge it?
Right. Yeah. So I should mention, somewhere in the 90s, I hung out a shingle and said, hey, if you're having these weird experiences, I'll talk to you about them, and I won't even take a donation for that. And when you keep that shingle out for 25 years and also write a book that becomes something of a cult classic and have a forum with, over 10,000 people on it talking about these experiences and all that stuff, which I founded about 15 years ago with a guy named Vince Horn. When you do that, you get to, before you know it, become an accidental expert in the weird, right? So that was the thing. And then how we got in this situation is actually really complicated. And it depends on how far you want to go back. But you could probably go back to René Descartes and Galileo. And, if you want to go back that far, but certainly Newton. And then basically in the Age of Enlightenment, there was this notion of the clockwork universe. And that was through Newton, and through Galileo and some people that followed Newton. And then through Galileo, there's the only real things are things that you can measure. And this, obviously, there wasn't an external way to measure it. Now we're starting to have some neuroimaging tech to at least see some neural correlates, and some things change when people do interesting things for their consciousness and all that through fMRI and EEG and other methods. And so, the Age of Enlightenment, which is ironically named, basically ended up, reacting against the sort of curious religious things of the time and said, no, reason, science, measurement, mathematics, and put its faith in those things. And a lot of amazing things came out of that, right? You have physics and chemistry and biology and biochemistry and a lot of cool medical technologies and other great engineering innovations came out of what resulted from that paradigm. So it's not like it didn't have its points, but it's also clearly only part of the story. And so, and that all really came to a head with the logical positivists in the 1920s or so, which were basically like fervent materialists. And, and then with the behavioralists under B.F. Skinner, who basically said consciousness is basically an illusion. You're just a robotic automaton responding purely to conditions. You have no free will, and all of those kinds of paradigms. And even Freud, who was fascinated by things like dreams, was very not into spiritual stuff and thought it was all just neurotic or psychotic. And so there's lots of other reasons for it. There might be developmental. So people who haven't crossed into this territory opening, like myself, before and even after I had those openings. So I was still kind of a fervent materialist even after I'd traveled out of my body. That's pretty weird to have that kind of strange relationship to these things. And so the scientific conditioning and the conditioning of our cultures and our tribes, like, my academic tribe was like, sort of sciencey geeks, right? And so, they thought, and I was, even as I started to have spiritual experiences, I was very uncomfortable with the language around those, or some of the weirdness of the traditions around those, or the cultures around those. I didn't like any of that, to be perfectly honest. But I ended up finding those things super useful anyway. Eventually, a lot of cool frameworks and technologies and maps and tricks and tips that have been developed within those traditions that it turned out to be super pragmatically useful.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think what's exciting, that what you're touching upon is why this is such an interesting time to do what you're doing and kind of help usher in this paradigm shift, is there is just a higher percentage of people out there that are going through these experiences. Like,
it
our
does
system
seem so.
needs to change. Like, sometimes I wonder, am I just in like a spirituality echo chamber because I'm deep in the spirituality path, or is there actually an objective higher percentage of people that are having expanded consciousness experiences relative to the kind of 3D world that we live in? And sometimes it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I think both are probably true. There's no question I live in a spiritual echo and bubble chamber. Nearly all of my friend circle has had these kinds of experiences, and are practitioners or psychonauts or deep meditators or retreatants. Okay, so that's true. But I think globally, meditation and psychedelics and yoga and practices and contemplation and all of the things that facilitate being more likely to get into these experiences are also scaling. So I think both are true.
So what do you think are the key linchpins that need to occur for this stuff to start to be acknowledged, and then subsequently treatment protocols to be provided?
Well, so when you talk about treatment protocols, you mean for the challenging stuff that is throwing people and or causing stuff people don't want, right? So the EPRC is focused on both, like, how do we cultivate the good? How do we cultivate the positive stuff from a positive psychology, resilience, wellness point of view, and consciousness upgrade, whatever. And then how do you deal with the challenges that can happen along the way, as rewriting the code while the operating system is still running, to use a very materialist metaphor. And obviously that can go pretty strangely in the short to medium, sometimes long term. And what needs to happen, I think, for the treatment side, is first, you need to understand the range of the phenomena that's out there in terms of what people actually experience. We think a phenomenological approach, which is what clinical medicine does anyway. I've never been able to measure pain, but people tell me, oh, I'm in pain. And I go, okay, that's useful to know. And then you can figure something out based on that. So I think a phenomenological approach needs to happen because that's what clinical medicine does well anyway. And we need a reasonable catalog of what's out there and what people actually experience. We need to figure out how to group those into reasonable taxonomies, and plenty of traditions have done something like this. And hopefully those taxonomies are not only descriptive, but also predictive of what may have come before and after in some developmental way, and also prescriptive in terms of what they then might lead to in terms of doing something useful, and also hopefully have some kind of neural correlates we hope to measure. I'm not going to say mind is brain, or in a meat and mechanics and electronics kind of way. But clearly there are neural correlates of some of our experiences. It would be nice if those kind of lined up. And it would be nice if it made some kind of biochemical sense in terms of dopamine and serotonin and norepi and whatever. And as well as a brain structure kind of sense of when you're seeing a bright white light, we would expect that to light up in occipital cortices and things. And when you're shaking, it probably has something to do with some of the muscle coordination centers, or it's one of the pathways that those go through, right? And then, so once you've got all that, then you can group these into diagnostic categories that hopefully then lead straightforwardly to treatment modalities. And then to validate those, you need comparative clinical outcome studies. So you need to say that, hey, this method of thinking about diagnosis and treatment is at least as good as standard of care, if not better, and may increase patient satisfaction scores, time to recovery, reduce bedtimes, reduce medication costs, we hope, and all of the things that you need to reach the MBAs and the lawyers and the guardians of the healthcare system and the insurance companies and the people that control the DSM and ICD-10 and 11, and the people who control board certification criteria, which are the committees that run, the specialty boards. And those, and those are the things that people haven't really tried to do. I mean, you don't really see there are a few people like Lukoff, Lew, and Turner, right? There's a few people out there who have tried to do that, and the occasional study, but this has not really been done en masse, and it's going to be expensive and complicated and time consuming and controversial. But I think if you can reach the MBAs and say, hey, this saves you money and it leads to better patient satisfaction scores and improves your quality metrics and increases your capacity to get your Christmas bonuses if you adopt this as part of your healthcare system, we think that's how you change the world. And so, because again, in theory, everybody went into this to know things and help people. And if we can show that, oh, you really do know more and you can help people better, then that's how we think we get this into the system. That obviously is an expensive and complicated project. Whole lot of facets to that. I could talk for hours about the big white paper and plan, but that's the basic idea.
And you do have a white paper on the site, correct? For people that would like to read that.
Oh yeah, if you want to geek out on how you change a healthcare system. I'm blessed to have been trained by some of the people who created the specialty of emergency medicine, which was done in the 70s. It didn't exist until then. And so they had some classes where they actually talked to us about how they created a new specialty, which in some ways is what we're kind of doing. I mean, it needs to be integrated into a number of specialties, but in terms of an interesting and specific body of knowledge that is not well explored or described yet, then I think that's kind of what we're doing. And so I'm blessed to know some of the giants that created the field that I trained in and got board certified in, and I'm happy to sort of follow in their footsteps and based on their roadmap to do this now for what we're calling emergent phenomena. So yeah, very grateful to all of them who paved the way.
And we'll make sure to link that in the show notes. And so I'm glad you touched upon, quote unquote, reaching the MBAs, because a lot of times I think Michael Pollan's book is a great example of something in terms of how to change your mind on how business impacted whether our society and institutions decided to embrace or not embrace psychedelics, specifically how a lot of the people that were experiencing transformational outcomes with psychedelics were actually, that was at odds with the pharmacy industry's ability to sell people pills every day. And so what is your perspective on, this kind of new emergent field of medicine and what needs to be done to make it successful with the people that frankly just care about making money?
Well, you already see major psychedelic startups, for example, that are making that are planning to make a whole lot of money as they, patent, Comp 360 or whatever their brand of psilocybin is, and are attempting to patent hand holding during trip sitting or whatever interesting things they're doing to generate. I know, right? To generate revenue streams. And and obviously that's what markets do. We live in a market economy, and markets will attempt to, businesses will attempt to secure intellectual property to generate revenue and to control markets and to generate market share and all of that. That's you can love it or hate it, but that's the world that we currently live in. And so that's already happening. Mindfulness is already over $1 billion a year industry, and the whole sort of meditation, yoga, et cetera, industry is many billions per year globally. And so there's already plenty of money being made in all this. And so our goal is to convince all of them that, most of them have stuck to kind of the shallow end and saying, oh, this is fine. It doesn't really cause side effects. Oh, you can mitigate all bad trips with set and setting and having a good clinical protocol and two people there holding your hand while you have this in your hospital bed. Right. And of course, I could appreciate that. Or like meditation never leads to anything weird. If that happens, it's all because of trauma and it couldn't possibly be meditation, despite 2,500 years of people saying meditation can lead to some really wild stuff. Or, Tai Chi is just for sort of balance and fitness, and it could never lead to weird energetic. It's like it's comical, right? But that's the sort of messaging and message that they've managed to put forward. However, it is also hard to imagine that people wouldn't be interested, and that markets. Again, we live in a market economy, so that markets couldn't be there to provide services and or competing protocols or therapeutic modalities or enhancement modalities based on better science, right? We hope to have all the people teaching meditation and yoga and giving psychedelics to have vastly better data to do what they do a whole lot better, and then hopefully be able to claim, hey, we can also handle the weird and the deep end, and for those who want that, we can provide you methods to get there, and for those who want to navigate it skillfully, because there'll always be people who, by inclination or just nature, it seems, just find themselves in the deep end, even if they didn't want to be. And so they need services too. And so again, I'm not much of a capitalist as these things go, but the capitalist realities of what we're talking about, there will be people who will want, provide these. And I'm sure the pharmaceutical industry is going to come up with Kundalini X or whatever for your Kundalini syndromes and rebrand and repurpose, medications to help you, carbamazepine and Zyprexa and God knows what. Well, we'll certainly get some new things, and they may come up with new and interesting compounds that really do help some people sometimes in certain circumstances with, stuff. Obviously there are plenty of people who have benefited from the world of pharmaceuticals. I'm super grateful for the antibiotics that are helping out a family right now to not die of sepsis. So yay, pharmaceutical industry, right? They've done some incredible things. I don't mean to demonize capitalism or the pharmaceutical industry, entirely, or even, 50%, right? Because obviously a tremendous amount of good things come out of this, and they will come out of it in relation to the deep end as well as technologies and biofeedback and enhancement devices and wearables. And there's going to be a lot of cool tech that comes out with regard to this. And we are not really pro or con any of this stuff. I'm sorry if I've demonstrated some biases of cynicism. Medicine will sometimes make you a little bit cynical about the pharmaceutical industry, despite the amazing things they provide, right? But the EPRC and the science we hope to do hopes to be a very, very neutral party to just give people high quality data so they can do informed consent based on, high quality data on the risks, benefits, and alternatives, which is what medical ethics demands. And so we're not going to be pro or con any of this stuff. We're just like, hey, we want people to make good, informed choices and to be as empowered as they can be with the best science we can come up with to figure out how people can do better.
One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is now that we have all of these, I think for any of the audience that knows me, like I had a kind of massive spiritual blowout, for lack of a better word, following ayahuasca that kind of launched me into a Kundalini awakening. And that, I had no support system. And it was really like a year of fact finding, of trying to figure out what the hell was going on with me, with very few people that could understand what I was going through. And at that time, ayahuasca was still a pretty underground thing. Psychedelics were just less talked about. And now it's like every time I, walk by People magazine, it's like how Aaron Rodgers' ayahuasca trip changed him, or this celebrity, or, they're just coming online. Like it's happening already. And so I anticipate there just being a lot more people that went through what I went through, which was like a very sudden, jarring, confusing experience. And I'm not sure that our current system can support that. And, maybe I'm wrong. It's been 4 years, but like, how do you see this all unfolding?
You mean in an optimal world, or like,
I just like realistically, like what is going to happen without a care model that's cogent and easy to accessible and effective. It's something I think a lot about, and I think everyone's really excited about, not dealing with depression or anxiety anymore, but like there's this whole other side of things that are true. I won't call them risk factors. I'll call them realities of when you engage in these substances.
Or meditation
I just don't
practices.
know that enough people. Totally. And I don't know that enough people are really aware of that.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of the people, you sort of find two camps. You've got the pro psychedelic people. Everybody should take this. It's amazing. You should put it in the water. Everybody should do ayahuasca and 5-MeO and whatever is the thing. And they obviously had some super positive transformative experiences, which clearly happen and inform their point of view. And maybe their friends did as well. So, okay, great. I understand that side of it. And then I also have, a whole lot of friends who have had train wrecks and serious problems that have lasted months or years, or sometimes even been life-threatening, as a result of some of these things as well. And I don't mean to be scaremongery or anything, but just both are true. And obviously as someone who helps people in spiritual crisis or emergency, it's kind of like being an ER doctor. You think every surgery gets infected and every person, who's driving is drunk and texting on their phone. And, that's, but in the same kind of way, that also means there is a there, and that needs to be addressed and cared for. And, in an ideal world, the world of the people who are promoting all this stuff would recognize that they need to do their due diligence and safety, just kind of like, if you've got an innovative, cool project like a Tesla, for example. A Tesla is a cool and innovative project and it's got self-driving technologies, but that self-driving technology is going to work a whole lot better if you've got really clear roads, with like really well-drawn lines on them and really clear signs and good guardrails and really high quality tires that can grip in wet conditions. And, there are all these things you need for a technology to work well. Or like if you've got mountain climbers, you need people who can do, have, bariatric chambers in case they get, altitude sickness. And you need, space program. You need people who understand how to help a spaceship do better when something goes wrong and a system blows or something. So for everybody exploring, the deep end, the far end, or that end up there even if they didn't want to, we need the support systems in place. And so in an ideal world, your local emergency department would be well equipped to handle these things with whole different additional diagnostic categories, both medication and non-medication based strategies, appropriate follow-up, and systems of mental health providers who have answers that are better than this is bipolar, schizotypal, or schizophrenia, or psychosis and needs meds, right? Because that's obviously extraordinarily limited. Though some of those are, diagnoses for life that basically are saying you're broken forever and you're just toast and you've broken your brain. Have a nice day. You're going to be on meds for the rest of your life. Like that kind of messaging is obviously seriously problematic. And so in an ideal system, all of those would be vastly better. And it would also appreciate the transformative opportunities of these for massive consciousness upgrades way beyond just okay. Right. Because, mainstream psychology kind of stops at okay. And wouldn't it be cool if mainstream psychology didn't stop at just okay, but actually building in next levels of resilience and consciousness and capacity? Right. So it's hard to imagine that there isn't some market there for that. Again, I don't mean to be too capitalist about these things, but again, the world we live in. And if you're trying to change systems, you have to provide incentives, not just sticks, but also carrots, and not just data, but also reason to follow that data and to change systems that have a lot of inertia. And so we think like the crisis in psychiatry and psychology right now could benefit tremendously from the positive messaging of positive psychology and the potential of these things, while also saying, yes, not only do we want to upgrade your consciousness, but if something goes wrong, we are also there for you in a next level sophisticated way based on really good data and good neuroimaging and good outcome studies. And so we think that's the kind of messaging that we hope to see in the world and that we hope to promote. Obviously, it's a long and complicated road to really do all of that properly. But that's what we're raising money for and building the team for and starting to do some of the science on.
Yeah, that's amazing. Are you familiar with any of the different unified models of consciousness, like any of Ken Wilber's work or David Hawkins?
Very.
And I love those guys and that just general kind of map, if you will, because before that, I had never really encountered just a description of like, here is what the subjective reality feels like here. And then here's what it feels like here. And then here's what it feels like here. And then here's what it feels like here. Here's what it can be like. Here's what here's what it's like at the next level and the next level. And to me, like that kind of unified model of experience is like such an important part of this, but it's also so tricky because so few people have transcended or have actually went through all of those different subjective realities. And so you only
Although
can,
more than you might think. And most of them stay quiet because they don't want the flack and blowback. As someone who's been out and public about those kinds of experiences, the vast, 20 to 1, I'd guess, people who have had them to the people who are out about them, maybe much higher. Because most of my friends are like, I would not be so crazy as to put myself out there like you did, in the early 90s late 90s, talking about this stuff online and seeing all the complexity that arose from that. Well, the climate's getting better, but it's still pretty hostile.
I totally. And I guess to me, there's some type of agreement that needs to be there's some type of agreement on what different states or stages or predominant experiences of consciousness look and feel like for us to do what you described, which is not only, help people stabilize, but actually, perhaps enhance or upgrade. And so, that to me is a really exciting proposition, but also a really tricky one, because it's kind of well, if you haven't had the experience, and this is all of spirituality, then it's very hard for you to recognize it. And although there's a lot more people that have had, these experiences than perhaps I would expect. I'd still expect that it's definitely not the majority of our society, for example.
I don't know. I mean, there's some days when I think it might be up to 25% of cross what I think of as the rising and passing away and had some first major opening. I mean, when you look at the data, the number of people who say they've had a major spiritual experience is actually quite large. It's greater than 50%. 25% of Americans think they've seen a ghost. It's, there's all kinds of interesting things when you start looking at this. And, people who have had some sort of consciousness opening or moment of profound unity or something, it's actually weirdly prevalent and yet not talked about. We don't have good vocabulary for it. It's not very normalized. It can be stigmatized, right? And so actually, I think the numbers are higher. And the other question of, can people who haven't had many of these experiences, or maybe any of them, recognize them? I actually think one of the great strengths that people underestimate about clinicians is their ability to pattern recognize really weird conditions, like Lyme disease, and multiple sclerosis, and Kawasaki's, and lupus, and these things that can present in so many weird, strange, subtle, bizarre ways, complex migraines or atypical migraines. They can do all this super weird stuff. If you've done clinical medicine for long enough, you recognize the incredible range of, those in the crowd who have done this will be nodding their heads. But, I actually think my clinician friends who have never had any of this, still, if you gave them the pattern recognition and the matching and some reasonable criteria, could at least do vastly better than they currently do. Right. That doesn't mean they'll necessarily be as good as the very best who have, plunged the depths and had a wide range of experiences across a range of traditions and modalities. No, they won't be that good. But can you get them vastly better than they currently are? Oh, I'm quite sure they're capable of that, because they already do it for all kinds of weird things anyway. And because clinical medicine can be very strange. And so I don't think this is out of the realm of their skill sets. In fact, I'm curiously optimistic about the ability of clinicians to do this.
That's a really good perspective. I mean, the idea that someone doesn't have to have had Lyme disease to understand what Lyme disease looks like.
Yeah, I've never had a migraine. I got really good at diagnosing weird migraines.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So your group is, one of the things I'm really interested in is, the way in which you guys are trying to determine the efficacy of various protocols against these different experiences. For example, we can take Kundalini, awakenings as one, just because I'm familiar with it. What is the mechanism in which you guys are going out there and trying to understand all the different ways that people are, for lack of a better word, treating or trying to stabilize these different phenomena, and then determining which has the highest efficacy?
Yeah, so the first thing is what we call the state-of-the-art project. And the state-of-the-art project is what's already out there, what do we already know, what are people already doing? That's its basic question. So we don't have to reinvent things or rediscover things that someone else has already rediscovered. Now, a lot of this information is sometimes siloed in proprietary traditions or hidden behind cultural barriers or paywalls or, language that can be confusing or secret initiations. I mean, there's a bunch of that, but a lot of this stuff is open tech. And you can just go on the internet and the great God Google will show you a staggeringly impressive number of ways to deal with Kundalini, right? The great God Google that knows all, sees all, and sells all, right? So very impressive.
Or the great God Reddit.
Yeah, right, exactly. Or Reddit or Facebook or all these amazing places where you could go and find incredible amounts of information. So actually part of this is we have actually the Big Data Project, which is actually designed to scrape social media and just find like what's out there and look at how people are experiencing this stuff and relating to this stuff. So that's one of the cool things right now is you can just go and there it is, and it's public data and you can take a look at it. The second thing is a tremendous amount of textual review. So we have some people like Olivier Sandilands and Brian Spittles, primarily at the moment, who are working on some of these. But also we have something called the Expert Opinion Project, where we want to interview experts in the field from an extremely wide range of traditions of like, how do you conceptualize the stuff? What are your diagnostic categories? And then how, for the things that are challenging, how do you handle those? And what do you prescribe? And what are your algorithms for how you know when to prescribe which thing and which person, right? What are your decision trees and what do those look like? And so we have a whole interview study we want to do. If someone's in a mood to give us a few $100,000, we'd be happy to do that interview study. But we're starting to do that actually already with the textbooks that are available and the internet and big data. And so there's a lot of different ways you can start to figure out what is the state of the art. We also have a lot of expertise within the EPRC of people who have practiced in an extremely wide range of traditions and sometimes many traditions. And so drawing on some of that expertise. And and so we're blessed to live in an information age that is incredibly rich and where we have unprecedented access to people and their experiences, and there are things that they are doing to be better in the face of those experiences. And so those are some of the ways we're currently working on that. I could talk on and on, but that's the essence of it.
That's interesting. It's a great framework. And I believe actually on the EA part, EPRC, sorry.
Something of a tongue twister. I know it doesn't, does it?
It's all good. You got to come up with like a cool little nickname for like the EPRC or something. But I believe actually the white paper outlines some of that type of stuff, or a portion of the website that I read before. So if people are interested in that, they can go check it out more.
But if anybody's interested in helping us with that, please reach out to us, info@theeprc.org. Be happy to chat with you.
Totally. And, one of the things that I thought was interesting before in a prior conversation that we had is that you guys are not the first people that have tried this.
No.
And you mentioned a group, I believe in the 80s or 90s, it was like, that you can't even find any information on them before.
Not much. Metapsychiatry and ultra consciousness and Stanley Dean, and it just disappeared, basically.
And so like, what the heck happened? Why do you think now is a different time? Because it's like, holy shit, like this needs to be figured out. And there have been bold, courageous professionals before that have went out and been the ones to raise their hand and raise their voice and have the courage to talk about this stuff. But unfortunately, it never took. And so, I'd be interested to get your perspective on that and how you're thinking about learning from those experiences.
Yeah, so we went back about 100 to the 1880s and 90s, which was the cosmic consciousness people. So these were luminaries in the field and in the academy who were, leaders of mental health movements and things that were talking about cosmic consciousness and integrating things based on a sort of a weird mix of understandings at the time that to us seems very archaic and sort of Victorian. Okay, fine. But they were trying to do this, and that totally got nowhere. And then you've got William James, a Harvard psychiatrist in 1902, who wrote the incredible Varieties of Religious Experience book, and that and wrote the primary textbook that people used in psychiatry for like 30 years, and then nothing, all gone. And then you've got, Jung, there's nothing of him in the mainstream. You won't find a single thing about archetypes in the DSM or whatever. Or textbooks of emergency medicine, nothing. And then you've got, the relaxation response people who are starting to get an interesting territory. All you get from that is like the light end of mindfulness. And then you've got, Abraham Maslow in the 50s, and he's studying peak experiences, basically like these massive, openings of wellness and energy and consciousness or whatever, however you want to think about it. And then there's nothing from him in the mainstream at all. In fact, everybody remembers him for his hierarchy of human needs. Almost nobody for his study of peak experiences, sort of disappeared from popular culture. And then you've got Esalen and the transpersonal kids. Starting in 1960 something, 62 maybe, somewhere there, and then like the whole hippie movement and psychedelics that was all totally crushed. Like the psychedelic stuff was just shut down by Reagan and all of that research. There was tons of research on LSD and psilocybin and mescaline, just gone. Basically, nobody remembers it. Not all of it was that great, but still, they tried, and all that was just shut down by Nixon and Ehrlichman, I think, when they made us all Schedule I substances. And then, but like transpersonal psychology is fascinating, but there's nothing of it in the mainstream. You won't find any of their criteria or diagnostic modalities. They didn't really do a lot of comparative trials to mainstream care. They just sort of thought of themselves as their own interesting thing. And unfortunately, their linguistic and ontological choices clearly were not going to scale broadly across the world of diverse religions. One of the koans we ask ourselves as we look at what happened with transpersonal psychology, which is really cool and interesting, and it uses words like Kundalini opening and stuff we're very comfortable with. But if you think about the koan of what scales across the world in the same way that like migraine care does or whatever, it's got to work in Riyadh and Rome and Reno and rural Alabama where I live, and none of the ontological or linguistic choices of transpersonal psychology scale like that, and we're trying to figure out what does. What reaches people everywhere in a just very straightforward, descriptive, phenomenological way that doesn't annoy the religions, and in fact helps them feel more comfortable being religious and having religious experiences and not feeling isolated and pathologized. So we're very much, and then so this involves a high degree of ontological agnosticism or neutrality. This is meaning like, is cosmic consciousness the fundamental basis of reality, or do I have an immortal soul that will be saved by our Lord and Savior, or what is the true nature of things? To stay out of those discussions in the way that provides good therapeutic relationships with people and stick to a phenomenological outcomes-based approach, we think that has a vastly better chance of scaling. And then we're going to need to do a lot of linguistic work to try to figure out what kind of language for this stuff does scale globally, and what are people willing to agree on, in the same way that happened with taxonomy and biology and mathematics, mostly through the 17 and 1800s, where there was a tremendous amount of negotiation of how do we do phylogenetic trees, and and what do we call, molecules and chemistry. And they just decided these are what we call these terms. They made a decision, they agreed on it, and they moved forward from there collectively. And we think that can happen with a very straightforward phenomenological outcome-based approach to emergent phenomena, as we call them. So those are some of the things we learned from all the previous approaches. And so we get to iterate and do our next attempt, and maybe we succeed and great, it's done, and maybe we don't, and people can learn from our failures and try the next thing. But we certainly have very carefully studied all previous projects to try to upgrade based on those lessons.
Yeah. The business guy in me is just thinking, like, isn't it funny how like copywriting and branding of these things is such an important element for adoption. Like it's more important than efficacy or reality in many instances.
Again, nobody's tried to reach the MBAs. When I hang out in these discussions, everybody's talking about neuroscientists and no one's talking about the MBAs. And I'm like, do you know who controls the world? Have you been paying attention here? The marketing people, the lawyers, the MBAs, like, are you living in the same reality I am? Because I think you need to figure out how to reach those. We have also Miriam, our lawyer, is working on a legal brief of like the relationship of the law to these things, right? And how can we then, what are the next steps that really need to be put in place to make things really ethical when it comes to relating to emergent phenomena skillfully from a legal point of view? And then we're working with some other lawyers around the globe, starting to do that, to think about other legal systems and how to do this and how to reach all the countries everywhere so people can have laws around these things that hopefully are just and fair and life enhancing rather than sometimes needlessly punitive or not based on great understandings of what can occur.
That's amazing. What would you suggest? Because since I've, like you, have just had a coming out party with my weird spiritual stuff. Since then, I've had all these people reach out to me and tell me what's happened to them. And
that's what happens.
I imagine there's some people that are going to be, I imagine there's some people that are going to be listening to this episode that are wondering, okay, well, I do have some of this going on. What do I do? What would you recommend?
Wow, that is a super complicated conversation. The first thing is normal. So I think 50% of the problem is just normalization. It's just knowing that this is a thing and that you're not alone and that tons of people have gone through this before you and have across the world from a range of traditions. And so reading books like, the Groff stuff, which is super helpful, I think.
That was huge for me. Spiritual Emergency. That book was amazing.
Yeah, and The Stormy Search for the Self. Like, so these are classics. They have their problems. They ontologically don't scale. If you're coming from various religions, they might piss you off, or materialists, they might piss you off. Sorry, but they do have some really useful tech. And like a Path with Heart by Jack Kornfield. It's a great book, and it came out of that same generation and that same sort of set of syntheses, and it's kind of new agey and perennialist, and that's fun and fine. Or if you're coming from a specific tradition, basically any tradition you're coming from has its mystics. So if you're a Catholic, you can look up, St. John and the interior, Dark Night of the Soul and Interior Castle and some of those. And if you're coming from Islam, look at the Sufis. And if you're coming from Judaism, look at, the sort of mystical end of Kabbalah, or however you pronounce it. I probably got that wrong. But, so whatever tradition you're coming from has its mystics if you go looking for them. And they may be sort of dogmatically, orthodoxly kind of filtered and processed a little bit through the dogmas of the tradition, fine, but there's usually some kind of tech there. Or if you're willing to be more perennialist, again, Groff's and, Jack Kornfield stuff or Emma Bragdon stuff, IMHU, their courses in how to deal with and relate to this stuff that are based on the best we currently have. And I think we can do way better than that. None of this has high quality outcomes data. None of this has linguistics that scale. None of this is ontologically neutral, but it might work for you in particular. If you're having Kundalini stuff, I find Tara Springett's stuff cool. A lot of people get a lot of mileage out of that. I've got a book on this stuff. It's free at mctb.org. And there are whole online forums dedicated to this stuff. I run one of them, the Dharma Overground. You can find, it's an online forum. It has all the pros and problems that come with an online forum, but, it's an imperfect world. But sometimes you can get great support in some of these places. And again, a lot of normalization. And then, yes, everybody's going to argue about what to do. What do I do with this? Do I do with that? Do I meditate more? Do I meditate less? Do I do this kind of technique? Do I do that kind of technique? And one of the things we would love to do is the science to actually give you a better answer than just a whole bunch of opinions filtered through what hopefully worked for them and, help them to stabilize this. And that's what they happened to find when they did their Google search or whatever. And so, hopefully we can end up with data that actually compares these things. One of the things we actually really want to build is something called the Emergent Research Center, where we bring everybody in and we have, people do what they do the way they do it. And we study them very, very rigorously and see what these traditions lead to. What do they handle well? What do they maybe not handle so well? What kind of outcomes do you get if you longitudinally follow people after their intensive 10 or 20-day retreat or whatever? And what kind of frameworks and technologies do they have to handle the complexities and to promote good outcomes and upgrades of consciousness and experience and emotions and well-being and all that? And then to actually head-to-head compare these things. So I use the analogy of martial arts all the time. And sorry, it's a violent analogy, but yeah, I think it really works pretty well. So all of the martial arts traditions were like, karate is the best. No, my dragon technique will defeat it or whatever. You get the standard thing of all the martial arts thought they were the superior technique and said so. But, mixed martial arts definitively proved, nope, none of you were the best. What works is a very skillful, thoughtful, intelligent blend of these that's very pragmatic and real world. And a trained mixed martial arts fighter is going to beat pretty much anybody in their weight and strength and training, level coming from a single tradition, unfortunately, sorry, it's just true. And so, In the same way, we think some kind of blended mix approach, drawing from a lot of the cool tech of a lot of the currently available technologies, is going to do better than any of them. Though some of the best of what's already out there do pretty darn well. So that that's where I'd start. But I think it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's a very big ball of yarn, but I think that is a helpful way to go about thinking about it. And I guess, kind of wrapping up here, Daniel, look, we want to help you. Like, I want to help you, which is why you're on this, which is why we're doing this.
Who you want to help is a massive group of people, right? So it's not just me. Just to be fair, there's a ton of people behind this, right? You want to help the team and the movement, right? Which is what to make sure we're giving credit where credit is due,
For sure. So if people do want to get involved with the EPRC, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, just email us at info@theprc.org and check out our videos, check out our white paper, get some ideas of where your resources and sparks of joy and talents and vision meet with the needs of the project, or if you see obvious deficiencies in the project and things we haven't thought about, like how you can lend those, hopefully. This is a decades-long project. So like if you're like, hey, I want to go get a PhD and help you, well, that's a way you can help. Or hey, I've got, this cool talent, or I've got these neat connections, or I don't know how to do this, but I know this other person who could, or wow, I've got some money and we can help fund your studies, or I've got these cool business connections, or I've got connections in government or at the NIH or, some national health service, or whatever it is, or hey, I'm a lawyer and I would love to help you research some of the legal things, or wow, I'm a business person, I would love to help figure out how to make your organization better, or I'm a data scientist and we've got all kinds of data science projects, or whatever interesting talent you have, media people. We've got all kinds of needs. And because this is a massive project, again, it's extraordinarily ambitious, and all previous attempts largely failed. So we're going to need to do better than them. We're going to need more people, more resources, more innovation, and more smart, caring, thoughtful people who care about this, making it happen.
Amazing. And I will make sure to link all of this in the show notes, which you can find on my Substack, which is scottbritton.substack.com. You can find all the episode notes and everything that we mentioned. But Daniel, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been a real pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge. I love your knowledge of history, I must say.
Thanks.
You are a steward of history, which is really cool. A lot of these kind of people that have tread before you and various things that I didn't know about coming into this episode. It was a real joy to learn about them. So thank you. And, keep doing what you're doing. It's very exciting.
Thank you. And thank you for your support and interest, and for sharing your story and journey, and for being willing to be out there. It's heartening.
Amazing. And thank you to the listeners. We appreciate you guys. And if you liked what you heard today, and feel like, putting some positive energy in the way of the show, you can like it, you can subscribe, you can give it a star, or whatever you want to do. But thanks. We'll see everybody on the next episode, and I hope everybody has a great day.